Hello! All right, presentation. What does Nietzsche think about avocados that come from Mexico? I'll be talking about agro-exports and its effects on biodiversity seen with the Nietzschean eye. So agro-exports, they are agriculture or goods that are produced for export. In most cases, these exports are produced in developing countries and are shipped to developed countries. Just move my face. Okay. Through an increasingly globalized economy, international trade exacerbates habit degradation at locations of production, not consumption. More than 25,000 species threats are connected to more than 15,000 commodities made in over 187 countries. And more than 5 billion supply chains have been evaluated in terms of their biodiversity impact. And about 30% of these global species threats are due to international trade, not counting invasive species. Developed countries import high amounts of coffee, tea, sugar, textiles, and fish products, among others, which contribute to a bigger biodiversity footprint abroad where the products are where the products are produced rather than at home where the products are consumed. Biodiversity loss is a global systematic phenomenon rather than a one-way blaming and condemning polluting producers alone without the context of that consumer demand, which is pretty much the whole reason it's done anyway. Many export-intensive industries are linked to biodiversity loss, such as coffee from Mexico and Latin America, soy and beef from Brazil, forestry and fishing products from Papua New Guinea, palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia, and fishing products from Vietnam. The International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List on Threat Causes associates threatened species with implicated commodities. Through a high-resolution global trade input-output table, commodities have been traced from production countries through several in-between trade steps to the final consumption country. They found a clear division between the 10 world's biggest importers and the 10 world's biggest exporters in terms of their effects on biodiversity. Developed countries, on average, import more implicated commodities than they export, and due to the environmental policies protecting domestic species that remain, this makes impacting industries find less stringent and conservationist policy-driven countries to set up their shops. On average, these places are developing countries. And developing countries often degrade habitat, which threatens biodiversity, to produce these exports. Of net exporters, 35% of species threats are connected to these domestically made products for export. This percentage is between 50 to 60 for countries like Madagascar, Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, and Honduras. Major supply chains begin in places with high biodiversity and export-oriented markets in agriculture, fishing, and forestry. The US, the European Union, and Japan are the main final destinations for many biodiversity implicated commodities. These net importers attribute 44% of their biodiversity footprint to imports. The US and Japan are found to be the biggest beneficiaries of export exploitation. Moral dilemmas here, folks. These include two main ones: biodiversity and economy. If biodiversity is affected, then, so are the people, the natural resources, and frankly, the entire climate. The economy also affects people, of course, and their ability to provide for themselves. The dilemma is the pursuit of corporate needs, which puts others at risk. This creates a conflict. Whose needs are prioritized? Normally, people with more money. Now, seeing this through Nietzsche's eye, whose ethical needs are and should be implemented? The eternal recurrence is a tool he would use to make a decision. Is a tool that he would use not necessarily to make a decision, but to judge the process. Would you be okay if this were to occur for the rest of eternity, right? There's also the will to power, meaning the power one has over oneself and one's weaknesses or desires. I put that quote there to emphasize that it is the power over oneself and not others. Nietzsche wants you to be your own personal trainer. He advocates for personal responsibility, be the overman, not the slave. He supports critical thinking. If the warriors of biodiversity and fair trade were to go against the warriors of capitalism and exploitation, he wouldn't come to the stadium with the jersey supporting one team because he just wants a good fight. He only comes to the game to see a good game. He doesn't care about the winner. To judge this scenario, he would use the thoughtless versus thoughtful method. Is one thoughtfully thinking about the consequences and results of lodging the Amazon rainforest? How much will money mean when temperatures are so high, when the weather is extreme, there's a deathly amount of UV radiation exposure because the ozone has continued to diminish, all due to the excavation of a huge carbon sink, not to mention all the pollution excreted from the machines cutting and transporting this commodity? I think Nietzsche would want people to engage in lodging the Amazon rainforest only if they knew their actions were to cause complete catastrophe. If she claims the responsibility, then she is the overman. I think Nietzsche would say, go her. But the same goes for someone fighting the corporate system. He wants a good fight. No one should be continuing in the footsteps of their elders because it's just tradition. He supports everyone having their own life, and he wants you to say yes to it. In the end, Nietzsche would want people to think for themselves. The possible action that could bring the situation closer to the philosopher's ethical ideals is thoughtful action versus thoughtless action. No price is too, sorry, I'm getting distracted. I didn't know this picture moved. No price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Also, this is very cool. Check this map out. I'll link it. It's a map that you can click on different countries and you can see implicated commodities and where the international trade affects different countries and who's importing and who's exporting those, to really get a hone in on our effect, on what our buying affects. So thank you so much. Excited to read your feedback. Bye, guys. Wait, it's still recording.